The Victron ESS system comprises out of the Victron inverter and some source of solar charging or solar inverter that's connected to the system, and a battery that's connected to the system. So over here in this first example, we can see that we've got set up with basically all of the products that we can have in the system. So we can have a grid connection running through the energy meter that measures some of our non-essential AC loads. And then on the same line we can install a grid tie inverter that can exceed the capacity of our inverter. So we can have a 8 kilowatt PV inverter on the input and run a 5 kilowatt on our output of our 5 kVA inverter. So through the inverter we've got our essential loads connected, and then on the outside, output side, we've got another furnace connected that's AC coupled on the output. And then, so we've got the grid tie inverter on the output side that's AC coupled. So with the energy meter installed on the input, we can achieve zero feed-in limitation from both of our grid tied inverters in this situation. We can feed excess PV power to our AC loads, our non-essential loads. So we can have the geyser connected over there, and all our bigger loads connected on the input side, and still feed it from solar power. So we on the Victron inverter, we limit it to the feedback of the inverter's capacity. So we can't feed back more than what the inverter can invert. So that's going to be limited, or limiting your DC coupled PV feed-in that you can achieve to your non-essentials. But your grid tie inverter can feed in extra power on top of that. So if you've got a 5 kVA inverter, you can invert 5 kilowatts of MPPT charging power to your non-essential loads and still have 5 kilowatts of power from the grid tie inverter feeding your non-essential loads. And then on the left hand side we've got our solar MPPT, Victron MPPT that is connected onto the system. So in these types of systems we've got advantages with DC coupled and AC coupled systems. AC coupled is going to be more have an advantage for households with higher loads during the day. So what that does is it will convert PV power directly onto your AC output line, and you've only got the efficiency loss of the grid tie inverter feeding your AC loads. Same goes for the DC MPPT. For charging your battery, it's going to be just the efficiency loss of the MPPT of the power going to your battery. Yes.
Silly question. This energy meter, must you have this energy meter?
No, it's not a must-have. If you want a grid tie inverter on the input, it's a requirement for the energy meter. And you want zero feed-in. So the energy meter just gives you the capability to feed non-essential loads, and on top of that, connect the grid tie inverter on
so
the
if
inputs.
you connect it only to your essential loads, you don't need it?
Yeah, so if you only have all your essential loads running through the inverter, then it's not a requirement for the energy meter. So the energy meter is just if you have non-essential loads that you want to measure accurately and feed from your excess solar power. So ESS system integrates grid power connection with a Victron energy inverter charger. So a GX device and a battery system. It stores solar energy into your battery during the day for use later on when the sun stops shining. So what that does is your excess PV power that you're going to limit and waste during the day, you store into a battery bank, and at night you discharge it from the battery bank to feed your loads, your essential loads. So in the South African market, the oaks that run the ESS setup, also have to work in a factor for load shedding. So we have a minimum SOC limit which you can set, which your battery uses, and the minimum SOC will be stored for use during a power outage or power failure from the grid.
Sorry, you only have your PV connected to smart MPPT Solar Charger, right? And you don't have the grid inverter or the AC couple on this side for your non-essential loads, right? But the essential loads are not connected. You still require to have that energy meter. So that's not requirement, is that what you said?
Yeah, not a requirement. So only if you want to feed non-essentials with excess solar power, then you require the energy meter.
Let me just get a follow-up on that. Going towards something else. So obviously people are becoming smarter in the way they now use energy because they see it more frequently on apps. And then they start asking me questions like, can we now power our non-essential items if our batteries is fully charged and we have excess power? But we don't have all of that configuration. The only thing that they had was the solar charger. Now they want to start bringing in the geyser maybe on time.
Yeah, but on the output of the system.
Yes, so you then just connect that onto the output of the inverter.
So as long as it doesn't exceed the capacity of the inverter, you can. But so majority of the time you'll have your essential loads running on the output 1 of the inverter, and then non-essentials you can either connect on the AC output 2 of the inverter, or you can run it from the input side and have an energy meter connected at your grid connection, and then it will just measure whatever power is drawn from the non-essentials and see if there's excess PV available to feed to those loads. But if it's connected on the AC output 2, it will disconnect as soon as there's a power failure as well. But you can configure the AC output 2 relay to stay on depending on battery SOC, as long as those loads combined don't exceed the output power of the inverter. When is an ESS system able to produce more power than it can use and store? It can sell the surplus power to the grid, and when it has insufficient energy power, it automatically buys it from the grid. So that's in certain areas where it's allowed for feedback, you can push power into the grid and build up credit. So the ESS system must at least have a GX device. That's a center of control for all the products. You don't need internet connectivity for the ESS system to work, you just need a GX device at least. And when is it appropriate to use ESS? So ESS is a self-consumption system, a backup system with solar, or a mixture of both. For example, you can use 30% of the battery capacity for self-consumption and keep 70% available as backup in the event of utility grid failure. So optimizing self-consumption, when there is more PV power than is required to run loads, the excess PV energy is stored in the battery. That stored energy is then used to power the loads at times when there is shortage of PV. The percentage of battery capacity used for self-consumption is configurable. That's settable under the ESS system. The other option, how you can run the system, is to keep batteries charged. So what that will do is just feed your loads from PV power, and the rest will be throttled if you do not feed in your excess PV power. So your battery will be kept at 100% unless there's a power failure. So in ESS systems with a generator, so configuring ESS in a system which uses a diesel generator for backup or extended mains failures can be achieved. So grid codes and loss of mains configuration will need special attention over here. So that's where we have to take notes of on which input we connect our generator if we've got it connected to a system, and make sure that we've got the LOM detection switched off And if it is automatic changeover from a generator, where you have ESCOM and the generator connected onto one input, you are not going to be able to disable the alloying detection and have a compliant system. So it's best to have a Quattro inverter if you've got a generator in your system. So where you have a dedicated AC input with dedicated settings for that AC input. So when not to use ESS, that's in off-grid systems, and marine systems, automotive systems, and inverter priority, as in dedicated ignore AC or intentional islanding, where you want to intentionally disconnect from the grids at times. So with and without grid meter, so ESS can be used both with an external grid meter or without one. When there is a grid meter, either full or partial grid parallel system can be figured to run alongside the grid. So where there is no grid meter, all loads are connected to the AC out, and where there is a PV inverter present, that is also connected to AC out. So this is running a system without an energy meter. And you're not feeding any non-essential loads. So if you've got any non-essential loads in this case, they might be connected to the AC output too, but they still don't exceed 5 kVA on your 5 kVA inverter, or 10 on your 10. So optional feed-in of MPPT Solar Charger power. So power from the MPPT can be fed into the grid. That can be set under the ESS, and you can also set the limits for the power that you feed into the grid at any given time. Fronius zero feed-in option. By using the power reduction feature in the Fronius grid inverters, the ESS system can automatically reduce the output of the installed PV on the system. So that's only achievable if you've got the Fronius inverter connected on the output in this scenario, or if it's on the inputs and you have a grid meter connected. So in this case, it's only on the output, so the inverter is able to measure all the loads and whatever it is feeding back into the grid. So in this scenario, we can achieve zero consumption by just setting up the communication between the Victron and Fronius grid. So it is not possible to combine ESS with a Fronius smart meter, but it's not necessary either, because you can achieve the zero feeding with a Victron energy meter if you do want to feed in or feed loads before the inverter from your Fronius inverter. So with ESS, it is not possible to disable feed-in in a system. It is possible with the ABB meters, but with that you also need the ABB grid meter. I'm not too sure what's the name of that thing, but they also can achieve zero feeding with the Victron, but you do require the ABB meter. So let's have a look at some example installations over here. So here's a backup system with solar. So all loads are wired on the AC output of the inverter. ESS mode is configured to keep batteries charged. So when using a grid-tied inverter, is also connected to the AC output. When grid power is available, the battery will be charged with power from both the grid PV and the PV. So loads are powered from the PV when that power source is available. Feed-in is optional and can be enabled or disabled depending on local regulations. So our components is an inverter charger, so that's a Multiplus or Quattro inverter. Note that ESS can only be installed on V-bus models, multis and quattros, which feature the second generation microprocessor. So if you've got an old unit produced before 2014, it's going to have a 19 processor, and they're not able to run ESS. All new V-bus multis and quattros currently ship with the 26 firmware. You're going to require a GX device. So you can also run ESS on the new multi-RS inverters. You're also going to require a GX device to be able to configure any of the ESS settings and so forth, and we have any remote monitoring on the multi-RS, but it has basic setup for ESS operation just from the Bluetooth app, which you can configure without the GX device, and then that will operate just as is standalone multi-RS in ESS operation. It can also be set up to intentionally island the multi-RS. So a GX device is required for the multi or quattro. That can be monitored locally via the VRM app or remotely via the VRM portal. You're going to require a battery. Third-party battery compatibility. There's our battery compatibility list on the ESS manual. We can also use lead-acid batteries or AGM and gel batteries. A battery monitor is also required. In most situations, it is not necessary to install. That's for batteries that have communicating BMS batteries that work with the Victron systems. So that list can also be found on that battery compatibility list. The only situation where an external battery monitor is required is when a system using a no monitoring battery type also has additional power sources, for example, a DC wind generator. So the battery monitors can also now be set up as an energy meter or DC energy meter. So if you have any or multiple sources of energy, DC charging sources that aren't compatible with the Victron system, you can still monitor their power accurately via a BMP. Just set it up as an energy meter instead of a battery monitor. So that can be either the Lynx shunt VCAN or the normal BMP 700 range. So a grid meter is optional. So an energy meter can be installed in the main distribution panel between the grid and the installation for full partial grid parallel installation. So a grid meter is not required where there is no AC renewable source and no AC loads present on the input side of the multi-quattro system. So that meaning it's not required to have a grid meter if you don't have a PV inverter on your input, or if you don't have any non-essential loads on the input that you want to feed from solar. If there is any AC source between the AC input from the grid and the solar system, incorrect results will be calculated and recorded by the GX device unless a grid meter is installed and enabled. So if you have a PV inverter on the input, it's also going to interfere with the readings from your Victron system. So in particular, without a grid meter, when renewable energy is being provided on the input side, the grid value will be wrong, too low or negative. The AC value will be shown also too low on the output side. So both those issues are resolved by installing a grid meter. So here we've got PV, it's optional. ESS can work with both grid-type PV inverters and or solar MPPT chargers, or a mix of both is also possible. So when using grid-type PV inverters, we recommend monitoring is performed using the CCGX. ESS can also be operated without PV. This is essentially for virtual power plants where the installation is part of a cluster for peak demand shading or that. So more specific use case scenarios. So generally, you're going to run your ESS system with solar power in the residential or commercial installation. That's just to utilize your PV consumption and self-consumption of the system. So here we've got system design. First section is the PV. So here we've got MPPT Solar Charge Controller and our PV grid-tied inverter. So ESS can work with either of those or with a mixture of both. So here I explain that generally speaking, the MPPT charge controller will be more efficient for charging or in a small system. This is because an MPPT Solar Charger is up to 99% efficient, whereas the PV energy coming from grid-tied inverter is first converted from DC to AC, then back from AC to DC, causing losses of up to 20 to 30%. That's if you're charging your battery bank. So this will be even more noticeable when the energy consumption occurs mainly in the mornings and in the evenings. So when most of the energy consumption occurs during the day, say in an office with air conditioning, a grid-tied inverter will be more efficient. After very efficient conversion to AC, the air conditioning unit uses the PV energy directly. So that's if it's connected on the AC output, then it's only the conversion loss of your PV inverter that's into factor. But if you're going to be charging your battery and running your loads at night, it's going to be more efficient to charge it with a DC MPPT. So the rules around feed-in differ all around the world in various countries. So energy can be sold back some places. Some other places feed-in is allowed, but it's not rewarded. Some places require that feed-in is absolutely not tolerated. So feed-in of PV power via an MPPT solar charger can be enabled under the ESS options, as well as for any PV grid-tied inverter. You can also, if you've got a Fronius connected, you can select to feed in all its excess PV power into the grid. And also set the limit. If you've got both, you can set the limit to the maximum amount of power to feed into the grid at any given time. So Fronius zero feed-in, that's achieved by setting up the Fronius correctly as well, and then just pairing the Fronius with the color control GX and setting it up on the color control or the GX device. So all Victron MPPT chargers can be used, both models with VE Direct as well as models with VE CAN. So if you've got an older model with a VE Direct port and you want to add more MPPTs to the system, you can use a VE CAN MPPT and wire it via VE Direct or VE CAN. Grid-tied inverters in parallel or on AC out. So there are two options when connecting the grid-tied inverter: in parallel with the multi or quattro, or on the AC output. So when connected on the AC out, the factor 1 rule must be adhered to. The factor 1 rule just states that the PV inverter connected on the output of any inverter, battery inverter, mustn't exceed the size of the battery inverter. So the maximum of the size of the battery inverter that it's connected to. So if it's on the output and you have a 30 kVA system, 3 10 kVAs in parallel, then you're going to have a limit of 30 kVA on the output of the system on the 3-phase grid line. Same for a 5 kVA inverter, can't exceed 5 kVA PV on the output. That is for in cases where the PV inverter charges the battery and the loads are very low, you can stand a chance to overload the inverter if you exceed 5 kVA. And the inverter's output can only feed or backfeed the maximum capacity of the inverter itself. So battery bank capacity. In a grid parallel system, the size of the battery bank has these effects. So small batteries will be more cost effective, but all available storage capacity is used every day. So small batteries will be charged and discharged with high currents. This will cause lead batteries in particular to have a shorter lifetime. Larger batteries combined with a relatively large PV installation can store excess power on sunny days. Power might then be available during several consecutive days of poor weather. Larger batteries provide longer autonomy during a power outage when the installation is required to operate as an UPS. The large battery capacity provides secure power provision for longer periods. So if you have a bigger battery bank, you're going to be able to store more excess solar power. But you're obviously going to need sufficient solar power to recharge the big battery banks. You can't have a small solar system and a massive battery bank, and the same goes vice versa. Have a big solar system and a small battery bank. So that must also be calculated correctly and sized accordingly. So inverter charger size, the required size of the inverter depends on the type of installation. So if it's grid paralleled, you're going to be able to feed some of your non-essential loads that is connected before the inverter. And if it is just connected as a normal backup for ESS installation, you're going to be limited to the power of the inverter that you're going to be able to feed. In grid parallel installations, the size of the inverter can be much smaller than the highest expected peak. For example, to cover a base load of a 2-person household, the 800 VA inverter may be sufficient. For a family, a 3 kVA inverter can run most appliances as long as not more than one of them is running at the same time. This means that the system can reduce grid power consumption from late spring to early autumn. That's obviously also a lot of gas installations that use 3 kVA inverters in the house. Anti-islanding. ESS always requires anti-islanding. This is also true for a no feed-in system. For several countries, the built-in anti-islanding in our products can be used. For example, multi-grid this is the Multiplus twos in Germany and the Multiplus in UK for C certification on our website. In case there is no certified product available for the country of installation, install external anti-islanding. So that's where it's a requirement to have anti-islanding, like in the city of Cape Town municipality. So if you're installing a Multiplus 2 inverter, you're going to have the anti-islanding built in, and that's already compliant with the city of Cape Town for the regulatory requirements for South Africa. And the Quattro 2 inverters are also in the process of being approved. So they are compliant, but not approved yet. But the older Multiplus or Quattro inverters aren't compliant at all. They will never be compliant because they only have one contactor, so it is required to have an external anti-islanding device. So those devices aren't intended for our specific use cases for anti-islanding, which requires 2 contactors. So the Multiplus 2s have got 2 contactors in series, whereas the older Quattros or Multiplus inverters only have 1 contactor, and that doesn't comply with the requirements. So for that, you can get the Seal anti-islanding box that is available from Victron Energy. So on the installation side, we've got temperature-compensated charging. So that's on lead-acid batteries. You require temperature compensation. If you're installing in extreme temperatures, cold or hotter areas. So then you can connect the temperature sensor, which is supplied, onto the temperature sense terminals, which all of the Victron inverters have included. So that temperature sensor can be connected, and you can then adapt the settings to apply the temperature compensation according to the measured temperature of the battery bank. That's not a requirement for lithium batteries, so you can use that temperature sensor and plug it into your Servo GX and rather measure your room temperature or something. Okay, that's on the MPPT. So the solar chargers will automatically use the information of the multi or quattro temperature compensated charging, as well as the V-direct chargers. So that's if you've got the GX device connected, your MPPTs or the other charging sources will automatically also adapt to the temperature compensation settings for your lead-acid battery bank. Okay, that's just for lead-acid usage. So on the configuration side for ESS, first thing you always do is update to the latest firmware when you commission your system. Make sure that all of the products are compatible with the features that is available on the latest firmware. So Venus OS 2 or newer is required. If you've got an all color control GX in the field, you're going to require to update it to version 2. So here is the instructions you can follow. The top line. So So that will just take you through the procedure of how to manually update an older GX device to version 2 manually, which you can't do via the internet. So Quattros and the ESS Assistant. So settings have to be configured on the Multiplus inverter. So that's under your grid tab. You have to select the corresponding grid code for the area that we're installing, and that's South Africa for us. We've got a Multiplus 2 that you're installing. You'll select the South African grid code. Other areas require other grid code connections, but that depends on where you're installing. But generally for South Africa, on the Multiplus 2s or Quattro 2 inverters, you can just set it to the South African grid code. And the Multiplus or all the Quattro inverters, you're going to have to set it on whichever grid code is recommended on the manual. That's usually on other. So you're going to have to configure some type of grid code onto the inverter to be able to load an ESS Assistant onto the inverter. So the ESS Assistant cannot work with the standard grid settings on the inverter. So it is required to set it to the grid code which is corresponding to the area. So here's our GX device ESS settings. The first option we've got is our mode. So that's optimized with battery life, and then we've got optimized without battery life. So at times when there is excess PV power, the PV energy is stored in the battery. That stored energy can then be used later to power the loads at times when there is a shortage of PV power. So optimized with battery life, you're going to have two options that you can set. Or one option that you can set, and then the active SOC limit. So you can set a minimum SOC unless the grid fails. So that's going to be the capacity of the battery bank that the algorithm is going to use to calculate how much excess PV you've used. So if you have a 10 kilowatt hour battery bank and you set it to minimum SOC of 25%, you're going to have 7.5 kilowatt hour available to use maximum. But if you only produce 5 kilowatts excess PV for the day, the algorithm will automatically notice that and see that you only charged your battery up with 5 kilowatts over the past 3 days. So your PV consumption or PV production is 5 kilowatt hours. So then the algorithm will automatically increase the battery capacity, the active SOC limit, to 50% in this instance, because you only have 5 kilowatt hour available to charge into your 10 kilowatt hour battery. Optimized without battery life, so it will only give you one value that you can set, and that value will always be the level which the battery gets discharged. So irregardless if you had 1 kilowatt hour of excess PV for the day, then your battery will only charge that extra 10% for the day and use that 10% again at night. So it's not optimal for lithium batteries. Lithium batteries do require to at least balance once a week or once every 2 weeks. So the optimized without battery life algorithm is not recommended. It will always discharge your battery and leave it at the lower state. Optimized with battery life will always try to recharge your battery up to 100% every day. Or if the PV production really drops for 1 week, it will automatically increase the battery SOC by 5% until the battery at least receives 100% state of charge within 2 weeks' time. So that's quite a long time of overcast weather, but the algorithm will automatically always try to extend the lifetime of your batteries by keeping them closer to 100% instead of closer to the discharge value. Then we've got the keep batteries charged mode. that just keeps your batteries at 100% state of charge unless there's a power failure. Your excess solar power is then just throttled, and only your loads are fed from the solar power. So external control, not too sure how that works. I've never used that. I don't think it's ever going to be a use case in South Africa. So for details on battery life operation, yes.
Just go up again. I'm not sure if we're going to get to that point again. There was the state of charge. In the portal, we can do there's forecasting. I'm not sure if they use the weather data for that. Is there a way to for the system to adjust the state of charge depending on the forecast?
Yes. Now with the new forecasting capability of the VRM, so if you set the correct location for the installation, the closest town, then you can get the capability for weather forecasting, and then that automatically, if your GX device is on the latest firmware, it will automatically determine how much solar power will be available tomorrow if it was perhaps overcast for the last few days, and then give you a bigger gap when you're on optimized with battery life. So it also only works with optimized with battery life, the forecasting.
Just to ensure that if during the day you did not charge, that it doesn't still discharge.
Yes. Yes, and then it will see tomorrow is going to be overcast.
So it won't discharge during the night.
Yes, so with the solar forecast, you have to make sure that you set on the right location and have all the latest firmwares on the products, and then you can use that. It's still in development phase, so it is working quite alright, but it's not 100% reliable yet.
And it has to be connected to the machine.
Yeah, and you have to have internet connection. So the forecasting is on the VRM itself. So it has to connect to the VRM to be able to access the forecast. So the nice thing is you can then also go on your dashboard overview and then go into the future, and you'll see more or less what your PV production is going to be. Then you've got grid metering. So select the external meter. If an external grid meter is connected onto the grid source. So all loads and optional grid-tied inverters must be installed on the AC output in the system with a Victron grid meter. So that's if you've got the Inverter Charger selected as the grid source under the ESS setting, then all of the loads must be connected on the output side in order for you to feed those loads from solar. But if you have a grid meter installed, you must make sure that you have it set on external meter as the primary grid metering source. Inverter AC output in use. So that setting can switch off the inverter DC power that it converts when it's connected to the grid. You can also limit the inverter power. That's in the newer firmware, it's limit the inverter power. So that's only going to be applied when the inverter is connected to the grid, that limit. Then we've got the feed-in excess solar power. So over there we can set to feed in our excess AC solar power or excess DC solar power. That's also where you go and see if the firmware's communication is operating correctly. There it will indicate feed-in active is going to be indicated as yes if the firmware is connected to the system. And multiphase regulation, so that can be set as per individual phase or total of all phases. So that only applies if you've got a 3-phase system. What that does is if it's selected on per individual phase, it's going to keep each single phase at the consumption of your grid set point. So if you've got your grid set point at 30 watts, for instance, then it's going to have the total of those 3 phases not exceed 30 watts per phase. If you've got the total of all phases selected, it is going to calculate the maximum or the total consumption over the 3 phases, and that's not going to exceed your grid set point. But what that does is, if you've got unbalanced AC loads, it will allow feed-in from the DC bus from one inverter into the grid, and then you draw that power that you feed into the grid on another phase. So the total consumption of the meter will then still be 0 watts, for instance, but it's going to reverse feed 1 kilowatt on the 3rd phase and draw it on the 2nd phase to feed the higher load on the 2nd phase, for instance. And then on some meters that can cause excess billing due to the feedback that it measures. And then you draw in another power again, so it double bills you for the power that you consume. So make sure that if you've got an electronic meter, that you've got it on per individual phase selected, the multiphase regulation. Here's our minimum SOC unless grid fails. That's just the minimum state of charge that this system is going to use for solar or self-consumption. And then if there's a power failure, you're going to use the rest of the battery capacity if you're already sitting at your minimum level. And peak shaving. Peak shaving can be used, you can set a limit on your AC input, and then if your AC loads ever exceed that limit during low SOC levels, then the system will still use battery to assist your limited grid source. So that's only if you've got a limited grid source, and maybe if you're on ESCOM direct with the varying power. Active SOC limits, so that's if you've got optimized with battery life selected. So the active limit is going to be the state of charge which algorithm determines is going to be available to recharge from solar. And battery life states, so that's just the different states that the ESS system is going to be operating in at different state of charge levels and different solar production. Here we can limit the inverter power. That's only applied when you are connected to the grid. Our grid set points, so that's the power that we are going to be drawing from the grid. Most of the times when the system is producing enough PV and the batteries are above the minimum SOC. So then you're going to be drawing the grid set point from the grid at all given times. So on some of the conlog meters, if you have your grid set point set close to 0 and maybe a kettle switches off, they tend to trip. What the guys do if they can't get the meter changed soon enough is they just increase the grid set point to 300 to 400 watts, and then that tends to help with the feedback on those meters. Doesn't stop it from tripping, but yeah, they still do.